Thank you for joining us for this episode of Crossing Barriers, Building Friendships, a podcast by Peace Lutheran Church in Spring Hill, Tennessee. Our guest today is Pastor Matt Steinhauer, who is pastor at Faith Lutheran Church in Lebanon, Tennessee, but also one of the assistants to our bishop and director of advocacy for our Southeastern Synod. Matt, how did you get into advocacy?
You know, it's interesting. I am a pastor of the church, and even though my letter of call says I will speak on behalf of the poor and the oppressed for peace and justice, and it's also part of my baptismal promise, I didn't consider myself a public advocate until February of 2015. I was ordained in January of 2011, so we're talking almost 5 years later, and I was attending a legislative reception for the Tennessee Disability Coalition because my son Matt has Down syndrome, and so of course I'm on their email list, and they had asked for people that wanted to attend, and I signed up for it, and I knew my dad was a state legislator, and I knew what it was. It was going to a nice reception with good food and an open bar. And I wrote all of my legislators and asked them to meet me there. And they actually did. And so I had the opportunity to talk to them about, being sure that they are on the side of those with developmental and intellectual disabilities. And it happened to coincide with Governor Bill Haslam's special session that he called for Medicaid expansion. His plan was called Insure Tennessee. And it was actually a pretty brilliant program to insure people who were in what's called the Medicaid gap between those who are on Medicaid, which in Tennessee is, of course, is called TennCare, who are on TennCare because they were qualified for that because of their poverty, and then those who were insured on the Affordable Care Act that was relatively new at the time, and who received subsidies from the federal government to buy their health insurance. And so in Tennessee, there were about 250,000 people who fell in that gap. And so the general feel of people across the board, I have friends that are across the political spectrum, and everybody kind of felt like it was a no-brainer. And within 2 days in the special session, it went down in flames. And I asked my state representative at that reception. We were standing in line together to get something to drink, and I asked her, where do you stand on Insure Tennessee? And she looked at me and said, Pastor, Jesus said the poor will always be with you. And I kept waiting for her to complete the sentence with, and because these people are poor, I believe that this is a program that will help them, and so I'm going to support Governor Haslam's Insure Tennessee. But she didn't say anything else. She just said, the poor will always be with you, like, that's just too bad for them, isn't it? And I remember I was deeply struck by this. It was a woman who professes not only to be a Christian, but she's a Christian singer-songwriter. And I walked back to my car on that cold February night, thinking about my son, Matt, and that a generation or so ago, when Matt was born, if he'd been born with Down syndrome, he would have been institutionalized. And somebody thought there is a better way for us to engage with these humans who are also created in God's image, even though they look different and learn different than the rest of us. And they were willing to go to bat for that cause. And I just thought, I cannot not speak out for these people without healthcare. And that's truly when I got involved in advocacy and started learning everything I could about it. I hooked up with an organization called the Tennessee Justice Center that's their specialty. They do health care for people who are poor and working poor. They work on TennCare eligibility issues, and they go to, they're a nonprofit law firm that represent poor people to be sure that they have their rights taken care of. And so along the way, I just met lots of other advocates. And when you start rubbing elbows with them, then you learn it's not only healthcare, it's immigration, it's affordable housing, it's school lunches for children who live in poverty. I mean, all of those issues, and you start becoming more and more aware of them because you learn the people's stories and that these are real human beings that these programs affect. And so I literally just got into it that way and have continued. And then about a year ago, our Bishop Kevin Strickland asked me to come on the staff of the Synod as an assistant to the bishop and be the director of advocacy for the 4 states. And so I now do this work, all over the Synod.
I remember when you had that pivotal moment. You told us at one of our clergy members about that, and you were just lit up. And you told us, for Lent, I have given up silence. And you were very passionate about getting involved in advocacy, and I've known you to be involved ever since. So as the director of advocacy for our Synod, what are your primary duties?
Well, my predecessor, Hilton Austin, just an amazing man who really got the advocacy program started in the Synod I think it was about 4 years ago. And obviously Hilton's focus was on the state of Georgia. His goal was to form what's called a State Public Policy Office, SPPO for short, in the state of Georgia. And so my job really has been to begin to engage all 4 states, try to get some sort of traction in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and Tennessee to have networks of addressing the issues for justice that abound in our states. And they're wide ranging. It's everything from immigration, LGBTQIA, affordable housing, just virtually any social justice issue we deal with.
And so why is it important for our Synod to be involved in advocacy?
I think it is, the more I have engaged with it myself, the more I realize that it truly is an imperative of all of us who are baptized Christians. And when you baptize somebody, you say, you promise to live with them among God's faithful people, bring them to the Word of God and the Holy Supper, teach them the Lord's Prayer and the Creed and the 10 Commandments, place in their hands the Holy Scriptures, and nurture them in faith and prayer. So those are the things that we ask baptized Christians to do. But there is this next little connection, 2 words, so that. We do all those things so that your children may learn to trust God, proclaim Christ through word and deed, care for others and the world God made, and work for justice and peace. And so it's our baptismal calling, to me, that really demands us to be looking around us and ask the question, who does not have a voice at this table because they don't have the right connections with a network, they don't have the money, they don't have access to, you know people that work 2 jobs to make ends meet, and they don't have time to sit down and write letters to their congressman or their mayor or their state representative. And so we as baptized Christians stand on behalf of those people and speak on their behalf. That's what advocacy is.
I think another way of saying that for our non-Christian brothers and sisters, a nation's greatness is measured by how well they treat those who do not have a voice. not by what their gross national product is or how wealthy people are, that sort of thing, but how well, as you put it, everybody has a voice at the table. And so what are some of the issues that are currently being brought up in our Tennessee legislature that we should be paying attention to?
Well, this last session was kind of a mixture of you might call successes from attention that we have raised, and then things that are going to need our attention in the coming months and years. One thing in particular, because I remember you were there in early 2020, I think it was in February of 2020, that you accompanied me and several others to go visit Representative William Lamberth, who is the Republican leader in Tennessee, over the issue of TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families funds. Those funds had grown in the state of Tennessee to over $730 billion. That's almost 730 million, which is $730 billion. They're intended to help people. If you remember back in the 90s, the congressional move to get people off of welfare and to work. We got to get these people from just being on the government dole and get them working. And so this investment in those people was to help them. If you think about it, because we're talking about infrastructure now is one of the national issues of legislation in our United States Congress. And so think about TANF as infrastructure for people who are poor and working poor. If you are a single mom and you have children that are under school age, the only way for you to get a job is to pay for childcare. And so the TANF funds were intended to help organizations provide childcare for people like that, so that they could then go out and enter the workplace and make their own way, become a more productive citizen. That's the way it was seen. But Tennessee was basically just not spending that money. They were getting about $90 million every year and not spending it. And so there were several of us that decided, we're just going to call this out and ask, why is this money not being spent? And of course, it wasn't just the 8 or 10 of us that went down to see Representative Lamberth. There was an outcry from lots of people. But in this most recent legislative session, they passed a bill to spend those funds, set up a new oversight committee statewide, allow for city, any kind of governmental organization, so a city government, a county government, nonprofits. We have a nonprofit in Lebanon, Tennessee, called Compassionate Hands. They would be somebody, for instance, that could apply for a grant. And so this would be a successful use of advocacy, just speaking out. And so people, elected officials took it seriously. The other issues in Tennessee, of course, are things like what is euphemistically called constitutional carry, but is actually permitless, gun sales. So anybody that's over 18 basically can buy a gun, and without any kind of training, et cetera, et cetera. I truly believe my son, Matt, who is 26 and has Down syndrome, legally could walk up to the counter of a gun store and plop down $500 and be able to buy a handgun, and they legally could not tell him, no, you can't do that. Fortunately, Matt is not into guns, so I don't have to worry about that. But there are other people who we all know do not need that kind of access to a firearm. Gunning up willy-nilly just to be able to buy a gun, I just think is not something Jesus would promote or do. And as a pastor of the Christian church, I have to ask the question, is this the best way for us to promote who Tennesseans are and what we believe in? And in the same session, they attempted to make the Bible the state book of Tennessee. It's not the first time it's happened, and I'm sure it won't be the last. And you can you read all of the passages in both the Old Testament and New Testament where God constantly speaks through the prophets or through Jesus on behalf of the poor, the widow, the orphan, the alien. Jesus is never representing the rich and the powerful. He's always representing the oppressed and those who are outside on the margins. And so all of those things, they just need somebody to be saying, are you thinking through this with the eyes of getting reelected, or are you thinking through this with the eyes of what's best for every citizen in the state of Tennessee?
And I would just like to clarify that when you say the prophets and Jesus always speak about caring for the orphan, the widow, and the alien, that when we say the word alien, we're not talking about little green creatures from Mars.
Right,
We're talking about the non-citizen.
Yeah,
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Immigrants would be the word.
Jesus.
So I want to back up too for just one moment when you talked about making the Bible the state book, and then you began talking about the prophets and Jesus talking about caring for the least of these among our in our society. It almost sounded like the Bible should be our state book. So why is that a concern?
But because, for one thing, you have the obvious belief in the separation of church and state. The First Amendment guarantees people that aren't Christian to be have the same opportunity that people that are. From a faith standpoint, it just makes absolutely no sense to raise up this sacred text as the official book of a state that does not act on behalf of the poor on a regular basis. The tornadoes that we had that went through Middle Tennessee in March of 2020, the federal government put out a nutrition assistance, like an EBT card. It was in addition to the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, SNAP, or food stamps as they're commonly known. But this was intended for these families who had children on the free and reduced lunch program so that they would have some extra money to buy food. Well, in most states, they just said, all right, we know this family lives at this address, and so they mailed them the EBT card. In Tennessee, you had to apply for the EBT card to receive it. So in addition to already dealing with poverty and hunger, you're asking them to jump through the hoop of filling out a form, which all of us know what government forms are like. And then you have to have the internet to be able to log on, because you got to do it online. And you have to have the time to do, all of those issues that just make it harder and harder for people who are poor, when they are the ones that Jesus said we are supposed to be turned toward. So that would be an example of why there's this great disconnect between the Bible being the state book and the way we treat poor people.
So how can just an ordinary person become an advocate?
Well, there are a number of ways to do that. If you go to the voting booth and vote, no matter which party you vote for, somebody is elected, and that you are a constituent of the person that is elected. If you voted for them, then that's great. If you didn't vote for them, they're still your representative and you are their constituent. And so you can send them an email. They do look at the emails. They in particular want to look at emails from people that live in their districts. A phone call, a handwritten letter is probably even better, or just calling and asking for an in-person appointment. So you can be an advocate that way. You can also be an advocate by gathering around an issue in your congregation. So at Peace Lutheran Church, it might be something to do with caring for creation. And that perhaps there is a piece of legislation that is going to maybe make God's earth not as well taken care of as we should. And so Peace Lutheran Church says, let's get 5 or 6 of us, let's do an advocacy committee, and let's do some outreach on this particular issue. And that advocacy committee may decide, well, let's just stay together and see if there's not something, every legislative session, maybe there's 1 or 2 things that we want to pay attention to and speak out as Peace Lutheran Church in Spring Hill, Tennessee. So it's as easy as sending an email, making a phone call, making an in-person visit to your elected official. And that can be your city council person, your mayor, your state representative, your state senator, your congressperson, your United States senators. You can do it at any and all levels that you want to. And let me say too, that if you go to the ELCA-SES, which is our Southeastern Synod website, there is a link to advocacy resources. So if you want to find the address for the governor of Tennessee, you can click on a link and it'll bring that up. We've just revised the website, and so we're still updating some of this. But if the link is not there, it should be soon, where you can just look up who your representative is. You type in your address and it'll bring up who your elected official is on a state and national level. And so there are resources that we try to provide. That's one of the things that I want to do, is to make it easy for people to be connected and to do advocacy.
Yeah, before we can actually write letters to our elected officials, we have to be informed. So it assumes that we are informed voters and are aware of the issues that are coming up in front of our legislatures. And I have found that keeping up with what is happening in both state and federal legislatures can be confusing and full of spin and very much divided along party lines. So I rely on people I trust and organizations I trust to sort that all out and tell me when and how to get involved. Does our Synod have a way of doing that? And if so, what is it?
Yes, we actually have a couple of ways to do that. If you go on Facebook and do Southeastern Synod Advocacy, that will link you. If you'll like that page, we try to post on there when there's an issue we're trying to get behind. We have an advocacy listserv that you can sign up for. We don't honestly use that yet as much as I would like to, only because all of us get so stinking many emails. I'm trying to figure out the most effective way to use that where it doesn't wear people out. Pay attention when there is a webinar. If you're on the Synod e-news, scan that. It's full of information. It comes out the first and third Tuesday of every month, and usually there's an advocacy item there that's posted to help people stay informed. I would encourage people to find the organizations. For instance, I started this off with the Tennessee Disability Coalition. Well, obviously disability is important to me. Well, the Tennessee Disability Coalition, that's their job, is to make sure that people who are connected with them know what legislation is coming up and know how to address it. And so whatever your particular area is, I promise there is an organization that can help get you up to speed on what legislation needs to be paid attention to.
And what are some of the barriers that are encountered when engaged in advocacy work?
One is the whole tension of being political. The church isn't supposed to be about politics. And I spend a whole lot of time discerning and praying about that, because obviously in my role as a pastor, you understand this. There are issues that demand being spoken out on that are policy issues, and you can't be partisan, but it does not mean that you can't speak out on policy issues. All the people that I look out on on Sunday morning, I want them to have addressed in my sermons and in my Bible study all the issues that affect their lives. You tell me a single person that politics does not affect their lives. And so if I'm not, and in this day and time, politics is a very important thing for all of us that's going on in our world. I mean, it's in the news every day. A national presidential election, the January 6th insurrection. I mean, all of these issues that we deal with, people in the congregation that's something that they deal with, just like they deal with unemployment or divorce or whatever the case may be, that they would come to, as a pastor, they would come to me and say, this is an issue that I'm dealing with. Well, politics is an issue that all of us are dealing with, and if we're not talking about that as people of faith, then we're leaving it to cable news. I'm trying to think who I heard say this. The people in the pews get about 30 hours of cable news every week and 1 hour of the pastor. Mm-hmm. And so where are their ideas and all being most formed?
I thought when we were, like at family gatherings at Thanksgiving time, there are always three things you shouldn't talk about: money, religion, and politics. But I like the way you say that, how we need to be talking about politics because it does affect our lives. Absolutely. So tell us how and why friendships matter in this line of work.
Well, friendships matter for a couple of reasons. One is we just had, was it this last Sunday in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus sent the disciples out to do the work of Jesus, and he did not send them out by themselves. He sent the 12, and it says 2 by 2, right?
Yes.
And so we need people to stand with who are dealing with things, just like we need people to stand with us. And so the friendships allow you to have accountability, they allow you to have support, they allow you to have a broader view. When you only come to the table with your own perspective, you don't have the richness of everybody's experience. And, hearing stories that I've heard over the last 5 or 6 years about people without health insurance and how it affects them, totally shapes my advocacy on that subject. Be in friendship with others who know different stories is just something that we all need to do.
Absolutely. So to sum things up, what is the single most important thing you want those listening to know?
I would say that the most important thing is to think about why we do this. And I relate that to our baptismal vow, which I shared earlier. I would encourage everybody to pay attention next time you attend a baptism and listen to what we say that we are going to do and why we are doing it. And to remember that in, I think it's Luke chapter 4, when Jesus first does his public ministry, he goes into the synagogue and they hand him the scroll and he starts reading and he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That's Jesus's marching orders to himself. And as followers of Christ, those are the things that we are supposed to be about. And we all can't be doing all those things all the time. But as Christians who call themselves Lutheran, I think it behooves us to try to be doing some of those things some of the time.
Thank you so much, Matt, for being a part of our podcast today. I know you had a very busy day and you still managed to find time to fit this in. It's just been wonderful hearing about the good work that you're doing across our Synod and for those who are the least of these among us.
Well, thank you. And, I was thinking when you invited me to do this, I remember when I was still an intern that you invited me to come down and supply for you one Sunday. I got my first taste of the technology that you had already implemented at Peace Lutheran Church. And you have always been, and I'm serious, you've always been on the cutting edge of doing things like this. And so this podcast is a great idea, and I really do hope that your people realize what a benefit it is to have the opportunity to hear other voices